Welcome to the People's Palestine University Online, a project of the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, coalition of individuals and organizations that seek to educate public on the 1948 Palestinian Nakba and the ongoing Nakba. I'm Professor Ilan Pape. I'm honored to present the third episode in this university titled The Solidarity Movement with the Palestinians. I will first of all provide a history of the solidarity movement with the Palestinians, and then I would talk about the situation of the solidarity movement today and end with some thoughts about its future role and capacity to influence the reality on the ground in the future. When Zionism began its own advocacy and lobbying, Palestine was without any solidarity movement, one should say. Namely, in the period between the inception of the Zionist movement in 1882 and the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, when Europeans, Americans, the Zionist movement were not only talking about the future of Palestine and the Palestinians, but were establishing facts on the ground that proved to be disastrous as far as the Palestinians were concerned. At that period, nobody can say that there was a global solidarity movement with the Palestinians. They were hardly heard by those with the power to change the reality. I can give you one example which I mention in my book, in which I write about the history of a very important Palestinian family, the Hosseinis. In 1930, the leaders of the Zionist movement came to London to discuss the future of Palestine. They were received with pomp and were honored as if they were already statesmen or leaders of another country. Everybody was waiting for them. They were able to meet anyone they wanted, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and so on. At the same day that they arrived, a Palestinian delegation arrived from Palestine to discuss with the British the future of Palestine. Nobody received them. There were two old ladies who probably were the first solidarity movement with Palestine in London, who waited for them in Victoria Station and were unable to arrange for them meetings with anyone significant in the British government. That was a kind of a snapshot of the difference between not only the solidarity with the Palestinians and solidarity with the Zionists, but the standing of the Zionist movement compared to the standing of the political Palestinian movement. The only solidarity movement I can detect until 1948 existed in the Arab world. Young Syrians, young Iraqis in particular, but also some young people from Egypt and further afield were, especially in places such Kuwait and Bahrain, were interested in what was going on in Palestine. And we see a movement of Arab volunteers who joined the first Palestinian attempt at resistance in 1936, what is known in history as the Arab Revolt. They joined as volunteers the paramilitary groups in Palestine that gave the British quite a hard time between 1936 to 1939. It took the British 3 years to quell this rebellion, and they needed the RAF to do that. And part of the military forces facing the British and their pro-Zionist policy were volunteers from the Arab world. So there was already this idea that Palestine is, for people in the society, if not for politicians, something that is part of their identity, part of their agenda. It repeated itself on the eve of the Nakba, where again, thousands of young people from Syria and Iraq in particular tried to help the Palestinians to resist the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that began in February 1948 and ended in 1948. So you can say this is the core for the solidarity movement with the Palestinians in the region. But at that time, apart from individuals, Palestinians had no advocacy, no lobbying, no solidarity in the society. This all changes in the 1960s and the 1970s. The re-emergence of the Palestinian national movement after the years of the trauma of 48 and the time it took to recover from the trauma, the reformulation of the Palestinian national movement, especially in the refugee camps of the Palestinians, as a typical third world liberation movement, very much influenced by the models of liberation movement in the third world, or what we call today the global south, located the Palestinians within the international solidarity movements all around the world with these liberation movements, namely people who supported the struggle of the FLN in Algeria, the Mau Mau in Kenya, the liberation movements of the left in Central and Latin America, and elsewhere in the colonized world, also in Southeast Asia, included the Palestinian struggle in that overall global struggle for decolonization and liberation. For the first time, we can record demonstrations and organizations advocating Palestinian liberation and independence in Western capitals in the mid 1960s, and particularly towards the end of the 1960s. It went hand in hand with the student revolutions, what is called famously this 1968 spring, the movement in America against the American involvement in Vietnam. All of that creates a solidarity movement that you can say is mostly in the left of politics, is very much confined to the left of politics, has strong relationship both with Maoist China and the Soviet Union. So it has also a kind of a global power alliance with it. Sometimes the relationship between the solidarity movement with the Palestinians and the tendency of the Soviet Union and its allies to support the Palestinians, sometimes the relationship was more troubled, more tense. It was not always, they were not always talking the same language, not using the same terms and so on, but it was still part of that alliance. It was probably the peak of that solidarity came in the mid 70s when this coalition of those who support liberation movements around the world was joined by some social democratic politicians in Europe, especially in South Europe. Aldo Moro in Italy, Papadeos in Greece. There were social democratic leaders who saw the PLO as a legitimate representative of the Palestinian struggle and definitely as a legitimate partner for discussing the future of Israel and Palestine. Remember, this is the time when the United States and Israel totally negate any legitimacy for the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian national movement. The United Nations reflected very well that solidarity when in 1975, with quite a majority, it passed a resolution that equated Zionism with racism. So even for a moment, you had some political elites in the West that were willing to discuss the Palestinian issue, not totally from a Zionist perspective. By the way, even Jimmy Carter at the beginning of his career, I remember also foreign secretaries of Britain like Brown and Douglas Hume, one Labour, one conservative, talking openly about the rights of the Palestinians, which they paid a very high political price later when the lobby persecuted them. This was the solidarity that was confined to the left and had some support among political elites, especially, of course, amongst emerging states in the global south. We enter a different phase in the solidarity movement with the Palestinians after the first Intifada in 1987. It was not only the uprising itself that reached for the first time many TV screens, including in the United States, that showed the difference between the non-violent Palestinian resistance to an occupation that was already 19 years old and the brutality of the forces facing the uprising. It was not only that, it was also the shift among especially Western young people in the way that they saw part of their trajectory in life as having a station in Palestine or Israel. There was a very interesting shift in the 1980s. Until 1982, I checked it. Quite a few young Europeans, especially, but not only, also people from Australia, New Zealand, I met at the time, I remember, and also from the United States, still so, until 1982, saw Israel as a haven also in terms of socialism, collectivism, new ideas, and so on. So they volunteered in the kibbutzim, they volunteered in the society. The same core group of young people from the 1980s begin to visit the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and see the reality of the occupation. And they shift their solidarity with Israel to the solidarity with the Palestinian under occupation. And they form the first, what we call later, the IMS, International Movement of Solidarity with the Palestinians, or the ISM actually it's called, International Solidarity Movement with the Palestinians, sorry, ISM. Namely, you see the connection between the ability to see what's happening on the ground, even before internet, just seeing it with your own eyes. Later, of course, with alternative media and the smartphone, people can see what's happening even without being there physically, with an understanding that there was an exceptionalism that added to the suffering of the Palestinians. So we can note in the mid-1980s the first establishment of Palestinian Solidarity Campaign Groups, the PSCs, in different parts of the world, namely a more organized attempt at solidarity by grassroots activists within the civil society that relate the struggle for justice in Palestine with other struggles, both domestic and global, from their perspective. But compared to the 1970s, this is far more diversified in terms of the composition of the people who see what's happening in Palestine, their own concern. And it's also the first time that we can see the beginning of progressive Jewish groups joining the solidarity movement. As we move into the 1990s and the beginning of the 21st century, and of course, especially when the Israeli war on Gaza began from 2007 onwards, the solidarity movement in the civil society grows exponentially. But what is very frustrating from a perspective of analyzing the impact of the solidarity movement, its expansion, its diversification, its knowledge, its commitment, but all are all on the increase, have less and less influence on the policies of the governments themselves, which is very frustrating for activists as well as, of course, for the Palestinians themselves, who would like this solidarity movement with them to be influential. And a similar thing happens in the Arab world as well. The solidarity movement becomes more institutionalized in the Arab world, more powerful, more impressive, and the Arab regimes that at least before 67 were still committed to some struggle are more and more seeking normalization with Israel. There is a turning point that, as an historian, I think we still need time to analyze how effective it is of changing the trajectory I'm talking about, namely the growth of a solidarity movement at the level of grassroots, at the level of civil society, that constantly grows, is constantly better organized, better institutionalized, works much better as a professional advocacy, in the same time has very little influence on the policies of governments at all. There is a moment where this gap is being challenged. And that, I think, is due to the emergence of the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction movement, more or less emerging between 2005 and 2010. The appearance of the BDS served the solidarity movement in two ways. It appeared at the time that the Palestinian internal dissent and fragmentation reached new level of disintegration. It was impossible between 2005 and 2010 to identify who leads the Palestinian liberation movement. Who is the Palestinian liberation movement? There were so many factions, so much competition, even at the time, even violent confrontation between different Palestinian groups and affiliates. The solidarity movement was in danger of losing orientation. So the BDS was able to give a consensual focal point for the solidarity movement despite the dismal condition of the Palestinian polity or political systems. That's its first contribution. But the more important contribution